It's a Tory win that looks like a loss and a Labour loss that looks like a win.
Security and the response to the ISIL threat have become a central concern.
Theresa May called this election and she's lost.
But ended up in her own coalition of chaos, a hung parliament.
Theresa May.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. The British election, not the result that Prime Minister Theresa May and the newspapers in her corner were looking for. Cuba and the film industry that goes where journalists do not. One of India's oldest news channels is raided and accuses the Modi government of a political vendetta. Al Jazeera becomes a target as the crisis in the GCC continues. And
once upon a time,
bedtime stories, Beijing style. When Prime Minister Theresa May called a snap election in search of a fresh mandate before negotiating the UK's way out of the European Union, her lead in the polls made her look unbeatable. She also knew that most of Britain's newspapers had her back. 70% of the papers sold in the UK are, like May, conservative. Those papers were hammering opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn, an avowed leftist. May's campaign was showing some signs of stumbling prior to those two terror attacks. First, the one in Manchester, and then last week in London, that pushed domestic security to the top of the election agenda. Now, that's a scenario when fear is in the air, broadcast on the air, in which conservative parties like May's tend to do well. But for some reason, that did not happen this time. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party surged, and Corbyn was saying aloud what many believe but few Western politicians dare to actually say, that it's time for a total rethink on the so-called war on terror. Despite coming under constant criticism in the conservative press, despite the state-funded broadcaster, the BBC, repeating some of the right-wing talking points from those papers depicting Corbyn as a security risk, his party won enough seats to shock the so-called experts and deny Theresa May the majority government and the mandate that she wanted, one that the papers tried and failed to deliver. Our starting point this week is London.
cruel dawn for the Tory party.
This was a story a lot of people got wrong. Starting with the Prime Minister calling an election seeking to strengthen her hand over the Brexit talks. Theresa May's government is now teetering, relying on a coalition partner to cling to power. There were the British papers, most of which attacked Jeremy Corbyn, only to see him, running on the Labour Party's most leftist platform for decades, rise to within touching distance of the Prime Minister's office. Most of the pollsters underestimated a surge in the youth vote. And then there were the pundits, who seemed deaf to a clamour of online counter-narratives
Weeks Labour have gone from strength to strength in the polls today,
breaking through their received wisdom. But just as Corbyn started to gain in the polls,
This was a suspected terrorist attack at a concert in Manchester.
terror forced its way into the election equation, not once, but twice. Given that Theresa May spent 6 years as Home Secretary, responsible for national security, she had some explaining to do. But the British press, dominated by right-wing papers, went to great lengths to somehow make the terror story about Corbyn.
Well, the day before polling day, we had a headline from The Sun, which was Jez's jihadi comrades. We saw a similar front page from the Daily Mail. So they're trying to push these perspectives.
You have outlets that are very definitely on the side of the government. The British press, unlike a lot of the media around the world, it's very partisan. So you're not really talking about neutrality, you're talking about taking a stand.
But the press can have this kind of agenda-setting function for the broadcasters. So, for example, in the Daily Politics show on the BBC,
Jeremy Corbyn has also come in for criticism.
The BBC photoshopped a picture for this segment of Jeremy Corbyn alongside a picture of Osama bin Laden. And I just can't see how this could be a defensible editorial position. But it shows how these kinds of tabloid-type common sense tend to feed into supposedly serious political conversations.
It's a toxic combination of the fact that there is an election campaign which seeks to use the media to convey political messages and a media which seeks to get the most sensational stories from the election campaign. And it's a symbiotic relationship that is particularly toxic in the aftermath of terrorist attacks, and I think that that whole mix is very poisonous.
The complaints from the Corbyn camp went far beyond the British news media's preference for the sensational over the substantive, or broadcasters who are supposed to be balanced, taking their cues from newspapers that are clearly not. Labour supporters have taken particular issue with the world's largest broadcaster, the BBC. They point to the coverage the day after the London Bridge attacks, when the BBC covered Theresa May's speech live, but not Corbyn's, suggesting the BBC showed a bias against the Labour leader that is more institutional than ideological.
The day had begun with Theresa May.
Our country fell victim to a brutal terrorist attack,
which sort of straddled the line between overt campaigning and being prime ministerial. And I can see that if you were in the BBC editor's chair, you would say, well, that wasn't campaigning, that's part of being Prime Minister.
But I think also in particular, the BBC is a state broadcaster. It's dependent on the government, but also just a whole series of networks with institutions of the state. Now, when Jeremy Corbyn first appeared, they couldn't make head nor tail of him. He may as well be from Mars as far as they're concerned. They are used to a certain way of understanding the political divide.
When it comes to security and terrorism, the BBC's always had very close relationships to the military, to the security and intelligence agencies.
We've managed to secure an exclusive interview with 2 serving intelligence officers.
There are quite extensive informal contacts between BBC security correspondents and the security and intelligence agencies. There's BBC Monitoring, which is a sort of open source translation service which provides those translations of broadcasting around the world to the security intelligence services. From the mid-1930s to the mid-1980s, for example, if you wanted to work at the BBC, you had to have your file vetted by MI5. So the basic framework of reporting for the BBC is heavily orientated towards those kinds of interests, and it will reflect those elite policy discussions.
When terrorists strike, the news media get on the story and stay there. Coverage tends to be dominated by the effects of terror rather than its causes. Journalists will dig into the background of a Muslim extremist, which mosque he attended, where he grew up.
Inside the gym where he trained.
But when Jeremy Corbyn talked about possible underlying causes, as he did after the Manchester bombing,
we must be brave enough to admit that the war on terror is not working.
Suggesting that Britain's foreign policy, its roles in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, may have played a role, British media outlets proved to be characteristically unwilling to follow him there.
The media very rarely talks about the underlying causes of terrorism. It's a very strong taboo within the media. There's always been a strong consensus around security and defence for the last decade, and I think the media has essentially been following the politicians and the officials in this point.
It's not fair to say the media have never engaged with this issue. I think that in the aftermath of the Iraq War, there was huge media interest in what had gone wrong.
Panorama's John Ware examines what the Prime Minister didn't tell us before going to war.
In lies that were perpetrated by the state about weapons of mass destruction. There was space then for a narrative about how British foreign policy was compromising British security. I think that in recent years it's become much more difficult to have that discussion.
It's actually quite important to say that there wasn't quite the establishment consensus that the media would have us believe. The Joint Terrorism Action Committee, JTAC, had said that the war on terror was going to produce more terrorism. MI5, MI6. This was not something that was unknown to elements of the British security services and the military establishment. The problem was Jeremy Corbyn expressing that.
Yet a poll taken in the wake of Corbyn's speech showed that he is on the right side of public opinion. More than twice as many Britons agree with his view on the root causes of terror than oppose it. So why is such a notion so foreign to most of the UK news media? Why is the search for probable cause in an act of terror such a taboo? It's yet another case of voices in the British mainstream, from the papers to the pundits, right up to the Prime Minister, being unable to come to terms with their history. They're out of touch and as those fleeing in search of online alternatives will tell you, out of date.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. The Al Jazeera media network, along with other media outlets funded by the state of Qatar, have come under attack amidst a diplomatic rift that is spread across the Gulf and beyond. On June 5th, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and non-GCC countries Egypt, Yemen, Libya, and the Maldives all broke off diplomatic ties with Qatar. An announcement on Saudi state TV accused Qatar of funding terrorism in the region, charges Doha denies. Qatari-owned media outlets Al Jazeera, the Qatar news agency QNA, Al Arabi Al Jadid, and others have been blocked across much of the Gulf. In addition, Al Jazeera's website and other digital platforms have faced systematic hacking attempts of increasing intensity. None of the platforms, however, have been compromised. The diplomatic crisis in the Gulf came 2 weeks after the hack of QNA and the posting of a faked news item attributing false comments to the Qatari emir. An investigation in which Qatar was assisted by a team from the FBI concluded that Russian hackers were responsible for the attack. Qatar has said that in the run-up to this crisis and since, it's been the target of a coordinated media campaign against it. It points to recently leaked emails of the UAE's ambassador to the United States, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, as evidence. The leaks revealed numerous exchanges with political lobbyists, including a U.S.-based pro-Israeli neoconservative think tank, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the FDD. Discussed in the emails are matters pertaining to U.S. policy in the Middle East, as well as specific efforts by the think tank and the UAE to discredit Qatar. In an article in the UK's Guardian newspaper, Al Jazeera's former Director General, Wada Kanfar, wrote that while the pretext offered for the cutting of diplomatic ties and the blockade of Qatar was, quote, the desire to cut the funding of terrorist groups and radical Islamist ideology, the most significant demand has been to close down the Al Jazeera media network. The Press Freedom Group, Reporters Without Borders, has called Al Jazeera, quote, collateral damage in the diplomatic offensive against Qatar, and said that the closure of Al Jazeera's bureaus is a political decision that amounts to censoring. One of India's oldest private news networks, NDTV, has been raided. Its owners are under investigation, and the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been accused of trying to muzzle the news media. On June 5th, NDTV's offices in Delhi and Dehradun were both searched by officers from the Central Bureau of Investigation, the CBI, which also raided the home of the network's owners, Pranoy Roy and his wife Radhika. The probe is reportedly focusing on allegations of financial fraud by the Roys. NDTV, which broadcasts news in English and in Hindi, rejected the accusations. It is clearly the independence and fearlessness of NDTV's team that the ruling party's politicians cannot stomach, and the CBI raid is merely another attempt at silencing the media. Just a few days prior to the raids, an NDTV anchor, Nidhi Razdan, had an on-air argument with a spokesperson from the ruling BJP party.
We will expose the NDTV agenda rather than leave it. All right, I'm done.
Sambit Patra accused the channel of having an anti-government agenda, and Razdan told him to either apologize or leave the set.
You cannot get away with this accusation that the channel has an agenda because we're asking you questions.
It looks like the online news outlet The Intercept may have burned one of its sources over a story it published into alleged Russian meddling in last year's U.S. presidential election. This past Monday, June 5th, the site published its article 4 days after contacting the National Security Agency to get the story confirmed. 2 days after that, the FBI issued an arrest warrant for Reality Lee Winner, an independent contractor who was working at an unnamed U.S. government facility, for leaking classified documents. So, what gave her away? An affidavit issued by the Justice Department says that The Intercept revealed to the NSA that the documents were mailed from Augusta, Georgia, where Ms. Winner lives. The documents involved and the way they were printed also reportedly contained telltale signs that pointed to the source. Some American journalists have castigated The Intercept for not being more cautious. The Intercept, however, tried to cast doubt on the government's account of its reporting methods, saying the affidavit and search warrant, which were unsealed at the government's request, contain unproven assertions designed to serve the government's agenda and, as such, warrant skepticism. Winner faces allegations that have not been proven. The same is true of the FBI's claims about how it came to arrest Winner. In Cuba, the government has long used journalism as a propaganda tool, and for that, until recently, it has been largely unapologetic. Following the revolution in 1959, the role of the news media was envisioned as one of education and garnering mass support for the Cuban political project. The country's film industry, however, has been a different story. Cuban film directors have been able to get away with showing things that journalists simply cannot, sometimes providing pointed critiques on the contradictions in Cuban social reality. On occasion, the films have even taken aim at Cuban news outlets, mocking reporters and the editorial red lines that limit their journalism. While contemporary economic realities have recently forced filmmakers to look abroad for their funding, much of Cuban cinema is funded by the very same state that it criticizes. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now from Havana on the role that film plays in Cuban political debate.
6 reporters from Cuba's state paper, a deadly meteor strike, and an alien invasion in Havana. A satirical short called Brainstorm that casts an acidic eye on journalism in Cuba.
Bueno, compañeros, como comprenderán, dada la gravedad de las circunstancias, tenemos que esperar una orientación superior para emplanar la primera página.
What's the story? What's the angle?
Tenemos nuestra tarea principal, es potenciar los intereses del pueblo.
What do they put on their front page?
Compañeros, ustedes se imaginan lo que hará la prensa extranjera con un titular que hable de 100 muertos en la capital.
Brainstorm takes place at a news outlet. There's this incredible news story, which would make the front page of any other newspaper around the world. The news that the Martians have landed.
We had a pretty good idea of how the US media would react to a meteorite striking and the possibility of extraterrestrial life. We've seen it in their films. But what would the Cuban media do?
No conviene sembrar la inquietud en nuestra población.
Ay, amor, la inquietud no la sembramos nosotros, ¿eh? La sembró el meteorito. Y vaya, si hay más de 100 muertos y nosotros no lo decimos, entonces podrías explicarme qué carajo es el periodismo.
For them, it's a given that whenever something important happens, the decision of what goes on the front page is not theirs, but rather it comes from above. A fictional short like Brainstorm portrays how journalism works, even seen from a satirical standpoint. It still has a lot of resemblance to reality. Sometimes I turn on the national news and the headline is that the farm in the province of Mayabeque met or surpassed its potato production.
Los colectivos azucareros de Mayabeque trabajan por elevar los resultados agroindustriales en
In fact, people say that if you want to eat potatoes, just watch the newscast. It's the only place you can actually find them.
Because if there's one place on the planet where news is not all doom and gloom, it's Cuba. The narrative devices, distraction techniques, and visual wallpaper in news bulletins are designed to produce propaganda. And so the reality of food shortages are glossed over with celebrations of harvests. And the challenges of the present are deflected with anniversaries of the past.
60 primaveras han transcurrido sin sombras de olvido.
Hay un programa en Cuba que se llama Cuba Dice, donde supuestamente...
There's a program on Cuban TV called Cuba Speaks, where the trickiest social issues are supposedly discussed, but it doesn't really manage to go beyond the surface of things. In the official press, the subject of Cuban diaspora isn't touched. Those 2 million Cubans abroad, invisible.
Se comportan como si no existiera.
The government has recently called for journalism to become more active, more critical. Cuban television has recently started to deal with thornier social issues. One show called Breaking the Silence deals with gender violence based on real-life events, dealing with very sensitive issues.
But progress has been slow. For the country's news media, even the word change is too sensitive, too loaded with negative connotations. So when they refer to Cuba's political and economic transition, they prefer to use euphemisms. The updating of the Cuban model is a popular one. Cuban film, on the other hand, has been less timid, much bolder in tackling the country's challenges and contradictions, and that's been the case ever since the beginning of the revolution. In 1959, the first cultural policy passed by the Castro regime was Law 169, which laid the foundations for a cinema production not just of creative expression, but of critical endeavor. In effect, cinema was seen as a powerful messaging tool for the revolution, and filmmakers were given a level of autonomy that state news outlets could only wish for. The Cuban film industry pioneered what became known as third cinema, an attempt to free itself from US cultural dominance and to produce a homegrown, more politically engaged, less commercially beholden cinema. The films that were born of this movement challenged creative, narrative, and very often political limits.
Cuban cinema has always tried to reflect and push further on subjects that have not been seen in official media, like TV and print. I think directors like Tomás Gutiérrez Alea have been able to bring nuance to the darkest areas of Cuban reality.
Films such as Death of a Bureaucrat or Memories of Underdevelopment were films that dealt with subjects with a heretic tone as far as Cuban TV or the national press were concerned.
Esta isla es una trampa. Somos muy pequeños, demasiado pobres. Es una dignidad muy cara.
Traditionally, subjects such as state security, Fidel Castro, the representation of national heroes as imperfect, as flawed, cinema has been at the forefront in dealing with these taboos.
If we think about issues covered in Cuban cinema, like education, which is one of the pillars of the Cuban political system, there are films that have managed to go beyond the often repeated line that, in Cuba, education is free and is very good. The film Conducta deals with education as a human story, showing how a teacher from an older generation comes into conflict with the values of a younger generation. Apparently, the filmmakers were worried about the film sparking controversy, but in the end, the Culture Ministry and a lot of teachers liked it, and it generated a good debate at the Ministry of Education.
The issue of sexual identity also fills an important space, a subject where Cuban cinema has led the way.
¿A ti te gustan las mujeres? A mí me gustan los hombres.
The film Strawberries and Chocolate promoted a discussion around these taboos.
Y no impide que yo sea una persona decente ni tan patriota como tú.
Sí, pero tú no eres revolucionario.
¿Quién te dijo a ti que yo no soy revolucionario?
I think cinema has provided an alternative means of communication to address certain subjects. Cinema has been able to deal with these issues in a more direct and raw way, in the way that everyday Cubans really experience them.
De una manera cotidiana.
Cuba's state media outlets like the national paper Gramma, the news agency Prensa Latina and state TV Cubavisión have never claimed to be anything but mouthpieces for the government. But this film scene might look familiar to the journalists who work there. So far, we haven't been able to reach anyone there for their feedback. We imagine they may be stuck in an editorial meeting.
Oye, la capital alcanzó el primer lugar nacional en emulación portuaria.
Finally, one of Chinese Premier Xi Jinping's favorite topics is the Belt and Road Initiative. Announced in 2013, the project involves China investing billions of dollars into building road and maritime links across Asia, Europe, and even Africa. Geopolitical types see it as another way of Beijing trying to extend its influence. China's largest state-run paper, China Daily, has been doing its bit, producing PR videos for the project. Many of them are produced in English, and the one that caught our attention features a China Daily journalist, Eric Nilsson, discussing the project with his daughter. Because if there's one thing that every little girl needs, it's political propaganda about infrastructure dressed up as a bedtime story. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Time for bed, sweetie.
Okay, Papa.
Now, Bob's gonna be gone a few days this month, and I'll miss you.
Why?
I'm going to attend a forum in Beijing on the Belt and Road Initiative.
What's that?
Okay. Once upon a time, several routes led from China through Central Asia to Europe. It was called Silk Road. People would put things on camels and cross the desert to trade with other people.
What's that have to do with the forum?
Well, a few years ago, China's president, Xi Jinping, proposed making new routes like the old routes, but even bigger. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative. More stuff can move around the world more easily, and people can travel more easily and build things countries need.
That's good, Papa.
So this forum is a chance to tell the world about the Belt and Road, like I'm telling you.
So it's just where moving stuff around?
That's a big part of it, but there's a lot more.
What else?
I'll tell you tomorrow, sweetie, okay? It's time for you to go to sleep. Love you.
Good night.